I'm on.
Hey, what's up?
Oh, it's just a lovely day.
It is. It's another OTXNT. We're doing it today. Got a busy weekend coming up, so we'll drop it now. Well, we're recording now, so going to be talking today about the question of remarriage because we've dealt with divorce in marriage stuff for a while, but this is the big question, right? Is when and should I get remarried if there's been a divorce? And where does the Bible see that as permissible?
And it's a big question. This is the one that I think we wanted to do the groundwork before we got here so that if someone thinks that we are rushing to judgment, they can look at the previous videos. But a lot to cover. You want to just jump into the prayer and then go for it?
Just pray, man. Let's pray.
All right. Lord, give us wisdom. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. All right. So question of how we should start this. Where should we do it in order in the canon on the remarriage piece? Start with Deuteronomy, go to Matthew, and then go to Paul? Or do you want to stay with Paul and then work backwards? You are the New Testament guy. What do you want to do?
I think that looking at the Old Testament will give us some backdrop to Jesus. One of the things I've wanted to avoid is getting into the rabbinic debate as grounds for the only way to understand Jesus, because that goes against our sufficiency of Scripture discussion.
Yeah.
So I don't think we spent a ton of time on the Old Testament. So why don't we cover some of those verses and then bring that to the question?
So, I mean, if we're going to go there, we got to deal with, essentially, you got to deal with what Jesus is dealing with, which is Deuteronomy 24. And so Deuteronomy 24 verses 1-5 says, when a man takes a wife, marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her and writes a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hands and sends her out from his home, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. If the latter husband turns against her and writes a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or later the husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. So that's an abomination before the Lord. You shall not bring sin on the land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. When a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army. So you go on like that. So Here's the deal. The big question is this, what is the meaning of the word indecency in verse 1? That she has been permitted that they've been permitting, Moses permits them to bring a divorce, right? Because that's debated in circles. When you look into that, it talks about uncovering nakedness. And so when I read this, and the way I've interpreted, especially when I preached it, this is right on in line with exactly what Jesus teaches in Matthew 5, which is that I think what Moses has in mind here is adultery. Is that there's been unfaithfulness, and that's when he writes her that certificate and sends her out. And of course, what this passage is also teaching is, so divorce is permissible in adultery, and it's also teaching that if she remarries, you can't be reconciled back to her. Once she's gone and married somebody else, it's over. And so if that were ever on the mind, I want her back, I miss her. If she's gone out and married somebody else, you can't do that again. So I think it teaches on really the way marriage should be, but I also think it's right there that the word indecency, I think, is probably the way that we try to understand in the New Testament what porneia was, of that understanding. This is the same kind of it's unfaithfulness. It's something that breaks that marital bond.
Right. And I would agree with that. And I think for the discussion of remarriage, one of the key things here is that the assumption of a qualified divorce is that permits a remarriage, that the husband's going to give a certificate and he can then remarry. And then she has a certificate. And what does that prove is that she's not wandering, abandoning her husband, but also she has the right to remarry because she's got evidence that she is freed up from that marriage. And so Jesus knows those assumptions, and that is worth recognizing when he addresses it. I wrote down several other Old Testament passages here too.
Bring 'em.
You've got the Deuteronomy 22:13 passage where there is an accusation that a husband married a woman and accuses her of having not been a virgin when they got married. This is an interesting porneia definition. And so if it turns out that that's true, he can divorce her. And if it turns out it's not true, he can never divorce her in the future. And so he forfeits divorce rights.
Because he brought this accusation against this poor woman. You know?
Right. And if she can somehow demonstrate evidence, then they're married. And now his other accusations won't be held. And so if divorce for other reasons existed beyond porneia, they no longer exist in this context, which does mean that maybe this is an adulterous type situation, the word.
And just to clarify, this passage is imagining a scenario where there's been unfaithfulness in a betrothal period, it seems. Not that there's somebody who has had a sexual past, because there's also, granted, that's probably not as super common at that time as it is today, living post-sexual revolution in the United States. But but even in the Old Testament, there are provisions. For instance, you'll see, like, if a man has stolen someone's virginity, that she's not obligated to go to be with them, but like the dad has to like acquire some damages from the guy, because what he's done is he's created a huge problem, because what can be said is an accusation can be made. So that has to be fixed, because you can't just do that. And so that's all tied in that cultural piece of somebody. So what they have in mind, though, is the idea of unfaithfulness prior to the wedding, it seems.
Right. And he finds out about it and wasn't disclosed before. And perhaps that's the evidence that she could provide, is that this was known before we got married and he consented. But again, his accusation now is not going to be heard in the future, even if she perhaps does have an affair later on. He cannot divorce her. Of course, adultery in this context is punishable by death, so that's a little different. We also have the woman who is raped, who the solution is, okay, we can get you married, and you can take care of her. This is, again, Deuteronomy 32. Without original offense, divorce rights are still assumed. So we have these contexts where these terrible things are happening, but the idea is, if there is false accusation, or if his accusation turned out to be true, he could divorce her. So the assumption then is that remarriage would take place. We have that weird passage in Exodus 21 with polygamy. I don't think this applies, but it's used, where if a man takes a second wife, he can't reduce his food, clothing, or conjugal rights to his other wife. That means that marriage has assumptions, though, of providing food, clothing, and conjugal rights to your wife.
Yeah.
So some people will say, well, that's grounds for divorce then, if you're not providing any of those things, which would go to the abandonment question in Corinthians. And then I guess just one more section here would be the Hagar story. This is viewed by some as God ordering a divorce of Hagar because of Sarah's frustration with her. And so that is an interesting situation. Certainly they did not come back together. But I think that the Genesis 21 passage is actually an illustration of that, marrying a second wife and denying her the things that are owed to her. And with the conflict between Sarah and Hagar, you have a cause to, he almost was obligated to set her free because he wasn't going to take care of her.
Yeah.
So all of those situations, though, assume a remarriage is part of what will happen after an authorized divorce.
Yeah. So the question we need to deal with, right, is when Jesus comes up in Matthew 5, when he's teaching on divorce and remarriage to the people, and he says the following. He says, it was said, whoever divorces and whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And then Matthew 19 kind of fills that out a little bit more. But it appears that what Jesus is doing is he's really just teaching what Moses taught, right? Was that there was unfaithfulness that was involved. And then he says that that's permitted, right? And what the big thing that I think is being said here, though, is is in verse 32 when he says, "But I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery." Meaning that if you divorce somebody and there's not been unfaithfulness on her part, then when she remarries, she's effectively committing adultery, because that should never have been broken, right? That relationship should not have been. And then he says, and if you remarry a divorced woman, then you commit adultery too. And so I think what Jesus is essentially saying is there's two strikes, right? So two strikes. Strike number one is you've now forced this poor woman to commit adultery, because it was a divorce that was never permitted, should never have been done. And then number two, you have become an adulterer because you've now sought somebody else out too. But with that being said, there is the understanding that if it's done, if there's a certificate, she should be allowed to remarry, or he should be allowed to remarry without any issues, because adultery has broken that marriage apart. So that's how I take Matthew 5, and I think that's what's being said in Matthew 19.
Well, and I think it's worth also just clarifying that divorce is not mandated in the case of adultery.
Yeah.
And so
you're right.
This is where a lot of people will assume that, well, sexual relationships happen, therefore God sees us as married. That's not true, because the Old Testament passages assume that, again, you've got to actually have some sort of marriage. There's the father can consent to allowing his daughter to marry someone who's slept with his daughter or not. And so that adultery that takes place is cause to break it, but you still don't have to break it. It's just, you could be consented. And so if you do divorce, though, the assumption is through remarriage of one or the other, adultery will take place, because you're going to officially tear the union, both covenantally and physically. And so that, I think, can get lost sometimes, because I have dealt with folks in my congregation or visitors of church who don't see any need to actually have a covenantal marriage through the church or register their marriage with the state, because it basically is reduced to sex, and that's not a biblical view of marriage.
No.
Also with so I just going to jump to Mark real quick. When he responds in Mark, Jesus says to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses wrote this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them female and male. For this reason, man shall leave his father and mother." So it's leaving your household, and and the two shall become one flesh. So we're joining together, and that is also a cleaving, a covenantal union between you and your wife. And they're no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So we do have this idea that this is why there's going to be an adultery. God has seen this as a unified whole. And if someone divorces his wife, he's going to make her an adulteress. Now, if it's for the cause of adultery, she's already done that. And so that's why I see the divorce being permissible. Is that?
Yeah. I think one of the things to keep in mind, I think we've said this in the previous videos, Matthew 5, right after Jesus talks, is he goes into the thing on vows. And I think there's a piece of that, right? Is that it's not just a sexual thing. There's a vow that I take that marriage should involve, is my vows before God in that. That's why I think marriage is different than just getting a license somewhere or anything like that. Like, there should be an aspect of before others that you hold that end up, right? Yeah. And that's recognized. So that's kind of where I think I'm at and where you're at on this. But then we got to deal with 1 Corinthians 7, right?
So just to summarize, we both kind of agree that if adultery is the cause of divorce, that remarriage is permissible, and yet still sad, still breaks God's heart, and he would still, I think, hope for reconciliation.
Yes, absolutely. If we already want to bring this over, Deuteronomy seems to make it clear, though, that, we'll jump. I'll wait because we have to talk about remaining single on that. But that's where I'm at exactly. I think you're permitted for remarriage if adultery has taken place in a marriage.
And if not,
And if not, then I think you got to look at what Paul says. And I think Paul makes it pretty clear that, and I think what Jesus makes it pretty clear in 19 too, is you got to just you stay put, right? So let's look at 7, because this is the big one, man, because I've had people ask too, because, and I don't know if you've seen it too, but COVID has seemed to put a lot of marriages in a pressure cooker and just rip them. COVID's not the one who did it. Satan is destroying marriages by using that. But, you think about the marriages that are the people who are left picking up the pieces are asking the question, am I permitted to get remarried at the end of this? Yeah. And there's a part of me that would love to just say, nah, man, I know that he did you wrong, she did you wrong. But without the reasons of Matthew 5 or Matthew 19, we really need to go look at, I think, 1 Corinthians 7 before I can tell you how I feel it should be versus what does the text actually say. So let's look at that. Where do you want to start in 7?
So I'm going to start at verse 8, because that's the question is who are the unmarried in verse 8. I say to you, the unmarried, and to widows, that it is good for them to remain even as I, which is single. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than burn with passion. And so if unmarried here is just all unmarried people, then it's like, well, Paul's not only telling us we can, he's saying we should if we've got physical passions. I feel like we addressed this last time. I think that if it means, it could mean widower, and I really like that understanding of it. I think it's clear. But if it means more than widower, it cannot mean that, unmarried then is specified below. So you cannot reverse what Paul says when he clarifies who can and can't remarry.
Exactly.
Below.
So if it means widower, then it seems like all he's saying there is widows and widowers, you're absolutely permitted to get remarried. And I would say that too, like, especially for a widow and a widower, you've had that person taken away from you. If you're one of those people, like, especially if it's young, and but across all ages, those passions, they're there. It's okay. Go back to it. But if it just means unmarried, then there has to be within the context of who are the unmarried allowed to not, you can't just rip that verse out and just say, there we go.
Everybody. Yeah.
So okay. So let's talk about then who can be remarried based on the context here.
All right. And so this goes to the heart, which I think Jesus is really addressing. Your heart should be different than, can I get my divorce now? It should be viewing things as God views it. So verse 10, to the married I give instructions, and not I, but the Lord. So Jesus says this, the wife should not leave her husband. So don't seek divorce. If she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. And so we have this situation where if you are an unmarried person, you need to remain unmarried with the hope of reconciliation. So unmarried do not have carte blanche to remarry. In fact, you're assuming that this goes both ways, that if a man is divorced, he also would remain unmarried, hoping to be reconciled to his wife. Some of this is written in the context of a patriarchal society where women had less rights than men. But in our context, I think it goes both ways, that if a man is divorced from his wife, he should remain unmarried, hoping for reconciliation, and vice versa. Yeah.
I think that's pretty clear. The goal is, if you get divorced, and it's going to happen, if it happens, and that appears to me, right, that's outside of, it's outside of what was permitted. Just, okay, remain unmarried, but don't get remarried. Which also skips the step of like committing adult. You're not remarrying anybody. You're not fooling around with anybody. You're committing to say, I'm going to remain single, or I will try to be reconciled with my spouse.
So if I'm married to the Proverbs lady that is like water torture, the constant dripping, and I can't stand it anymore, and I get divorced, and the cause for my divorce was no cause in the state of Arizona, no fault divorce, I cannot remarry. One, as a Christian, I'm ordered not to do that divorce. So that's the first thing. I cannot get divorced. I have no legal grounds for divorce biblically. No Christian grounds. But if I did it anyway, I have no grounds for remarriage, because I am ordered to remain unmarried with the hope of reconciling with my wife.
Yeah.
And that's me being the actor on the divorce. If I'm the receiver on the divorce, which is out of my hands perhaps, I still need to remain unmarried with the hopes that I could be reconciled to my wife.
Yeah. So then the question is, then let's do it now. Let's bring up the scenario of Deuteronomy 24, right? Which is, woman gets kicked out. She's committed adultery. She's got her certificate. She marries somebody else. She can't come back to him. It's over. Reconciliation is not possible. But that document does assume that there might be reconciliation, that he might want that. But it says it's too late if she's already married somebody else. So I guess the big question is, if that person leaves you, if that person has walked off on you and then remarried somebody else, are you permitted to remarry?
I would say that takes us back to Jesus, where I have now been either made an adulterer or the wife has been made an adulteress because he's gone to another woman. And so the covenantal break took place by us filing divorce. But the intimacy, the union that does occur sexually, because this is a physical action that seals a covenant exchange. I am yours, you are mine. We are one. And so it's fully broken now through someone going and remarrying. Now I feel like, okay, I have already been made an adulterer. It's over. And therefore, there has now been the cause that Jesus gives for the divorce. And so reconciliation cannot take place. So maybe now I'm able to remarry.
Yeah. But And I think that's the kind of understanding that puts us back at Matthew 19, right? Which is the kind of shock that they say is, if the relationship is like this, it's better not to marry. And then it's what you had brought up prior to us getting on, right? Is that falls right into Matthew 19:12 on the eunuch statement. And so you take that statement when he says, for their eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it. You tie that into the understanding of refraining from that. The people who make themselves eunuchs are those who have decided that because I want to take seriously the understanding of the way the Bible has presented this, I will refrain from remarrying and seek reconciliation until it's no longer able to.
And yes, and that's where I'm at, is the eunuch statement is related to the marriage discussion, because his answer to them saying this is hard is, yes, it is. You have to accept that it's hard, but some people are eunuchs born that way, others are made eunuchs, and some make themselves eunuchs. So some will consent to the reality that I will not intentionally make my wife an adulteress or my ex-wife an adulteress or myself an adulterer. And if we have had a divorce that was beyond, if I'm divorced beyond my control, I'm going to remain single. I'm going to remain abstinent in hopes that I can be reunited to my wife. But Moses is not reversed here. If my wife marries someone else and then that guy dies and she wants to come back to me and I've remained single, I cannot remarry her, because she has been defiled, at least for me, that we have been torn apart. And that cannot be reconciled according to Moses. And Jesus doesn't undo that. And so in my mindset, that means that I'm freed from that commitment if she remarries someone else. She's made me an adulterer at that point.
If she remarries, or if somebody, or as you get thrown finally into the widower camp, I would assume too.
Right.
That you're no longer bound if she's gone, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the end of 1 Corinthians, right? So the very end of the chapter, he comes back. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. And there's another video we could make.
That's another one for sure. So that clears up a lot of stuff in 1 Corinthians. This understanding clears up when you read something like, okay, so Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 says, 27, he said in verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Don't seek a wife. Now, that seems to be as in the context that if you've been released, that you're loosed from the vow of, you're not tied down in the sense of you're not actually married. Not that you've been divorced, but that it just seems like you're not part of those obligations that come, the vows that come with it. Because verse 28 says, however, if you do get married, you've not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. By such people will have troubles in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. And so what I think is being said is kind of what he said in verse 25. To the virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I do give an opinion. And so I think what he's talking about is those people who are married, stay as you are, enjoy being married. If you don't have a spouse, if you're unmarried, and I think that you got to keep in context that whole letter so far, that if you do get married, so a widow or a virgin, somebody who's never been married, have had the vows, you're not sinning. Right? Because it seems like in Corinth, they were asking, should we abstain from all sexual activity? Because even in our marriages, right? And so, no, like you have the desire, get married. But that has to be in check, I think, with what you just brought up in the same line of verse 8 and 9, right? That it's okay, you can get married. But I think that that line can't be pulled out of context the same way that the others are. That we're talking about virgins, we're talking about people who are, I think kind of that whole thing of verse 8 of who can get in, and that's okay to marry.
Yeah, and I would just clarify verse 15. I even read an article today that said, in this case, that means they're free to remarry, because it says an unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. That word for bondage, I talked about this in a previous video, is not the same word as in verse 39. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives. The freedom there is from the obligation to be with that spouse. It's not freedom to go remarry in that context. It's me saying, I've been divorced. What do I do about this? You can have peace. You don't have to try and force reconciliation or whatever. But in that context, you don't remarry. You're not free to remarry there. You're free from your marital covenant. Essentially, you've been abandoned, so you don't have to be torn up about it. Let the unbelieving husband or wife leave in that context. But bound there is not free to remarry. And that's, in my mind, been misinterpreted by many. Paul tells us when you're free to remarry, and Jesus does as well, I think. They generally don't speak highly of remarriage following divorce anyway. But the whole attitude should be a Christian should try very much to maintain their marriage.
Yeah.
And even if there has been an adultery, you're not obligated to divorce, but Jesus will consent that you can get it there. And my view is then if the marriage bond is fully broken through an actual divorce and a breaking of the physical vows and adultery has taken place, then remarriage is permissible.
So just a couple practical points to consider then too, which is if you are watching or listening and you have been remarried after a divorce, not for the biblical reasons, just to clarify, first thing is this is not the unforgivable sin.
Right.
Second off, if you've never given that to the Lord, if you've never walked through and thought that this was sin, the way that this divorce took place and even the remarriage, then you need to have that conversation with God. But thirdly, you need to understand that now that you are remarried, you are not to go back and try to re-seek reconciliation with that spouse. What's done is done. It's over. And I think what you've done is once you've dealt with it with the Lord, you leave it alone and you begin to now say, okay, well, how do I do something different in this marriage? So, if you've already hit that point, move on, give it up to God, but now look at how do I make this marriage work? How do I live for the Lord in this marriage? But make sure you've dealt with how that all took place and what has happened. And make sure you've had that conversation with God over that all. Anything else you'd add to that?
Yeah, if you are either presently divorced or considering divorce, and it's not for cause of adultery, the last thing you need to do is start thinking of plan B. Who's my next wife? Who's my next spouse? I'm free to hit the dating scene again. Absolutely not. Your goal is that God would change your heart and your spouse's heart, and that reconciliation could take place, because your marriage is a picture of God's love to the world. And one of the greatest testimonies a married couple have is their marriage. It is pointing to the wholeness of God and his covenant to man. And so the world is always saying, well, who's your next option? Hopefully your first option is your next option. Hopefully this tearing asunder can be healed. And the world is typically pushing you as far away from that as possible. So if you're a Christian, don't divorce. And if you find yourself divorced, recognize that unless it's for the grounds given in the Bible, that you need to pursue singleness and pursue a wholeness in God, with the hope that that could be reversed.
Hey, good stuff, man. Lot that we need to work through. I know it's a tough topic because the stats are of where we're at in divorce in our culture anyways. But I do think it's one that's needed, because there are people who are asking, what about plan B? And I think, well, let's go like this. And really this study has opened my eyes, because there's a lot of implications too about, as a pastor, my role in remarrying people too.
Yes.
My conscience is bound to what the text has said. And so that makes you going to have to draw a line in the sand and say, I can't, because I won't, because this is what I believe. Right. So it's having to work through this has really pulled me and stretched me in this for sure, because it's, once again, this is another one of those topics that we've just kind of been passed down. Here's how you do it. This is when it's permissible, that kind of a thing. And when you actually start looking into the text, you realize I need to reevaluate what I've been passed down. I need to evaluate what I just kind of took for granted and understood. So yeah, this is good stuff, man. It's hard. It's definitely, it brings you to the same point. If the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. Yeah. That's the point. Is
in some cases it's absolutely true, right? That's some people are going to have a hard lot because of the way the marriage didn't turn out like they had. And Jesus says, it's tough to accept. But again, we also know it's a blessing from the Lord. Marriage is wonderful. It's a beautiful picture. So there's great value in marriage. But yeah, this has stretched me a lot. I've moved back and forth a number of times in this, and until we brought all the passages together, I've evolved a little bit on this, but I not so much. I think I landed about where I was, but I've got a much better grounding, I think. So I hope this is a valuable series for people.
For sure. At some point, I think I want to deal with the singleness piece, right? I think that's another topic that kind of goes with this, is to kind of close it all up, is what about being single, right? So obviously the piece of remarriage should remain single, but what about those who have never married and want to, who aren't, and what is the view of them? And so I think we should deal with singleness as it's presented in the Bible as well, because it's not weirdness. It's not different. There's a calling, there's a gifting that comes with that we should talk about, and recognize that if God has given you that, God's given you that. And you're that's just a different path that God has placed for you. And so how do we discuss that? How do we recognize that that's also a valid option? And I guess, the reality is, if we really did this right as a church, there would probably be a lot more single church people at the end of the day, if we're trying to go right by what the text says too. But singleness, I think, should be dealt with, because we need to talk about it, because I think there's a lot of either misconceptions. I don't think God has wired everybody for marriage, or has the plan that marriage be part of their plan. And so how do you sift through that? How do you work through that, for sure?
Yeah, I think it's a good one to follow. And of course, we've got a whole host. And if you've got any questions or things you'd like us to cover, please leave us a comment and take some time maybe to like this video or rate this podcast, share this. If you'll share this, that'll really help get the word out. And if it's the kind of working through scripture that you appreciate, we would appreciate it if you would let your friends know.
And if you're ever in Tucson, come to North Swan Baptist Church, go visit Andrew, and just take him to lunch after church. He would love that. I like
lunch
lunch too.
if you're in the
Or
Phoenix
if you're in
area.
Phoenix, or you want to just hit up both of us in the same day, it's not possible. But one week after the next, you should. And Andrew, you will find, is way more hospitable than I am. He'll spend way more time with you. So it's open invitation. All right, let's close this out. You ready?
All right, I'm ready.
All right. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look with favor on you and give you peace. Thanks for watching. Talk to you guys later. Andrew, this is fun. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
All right.